All right, welcome back, guys. So up next, we have the empowering iOS developers. And without further ado, please welcome Samuel Giddins.
So I'm going to start this off with a couple of questions for you all. You can pretend to be engaged. I know it's been a long couple of days. We're almost at the end. So give you a chance to settle back into like sitting down and listening. To start off with, who here would call themselves an iOS developer? Okay, so a couple of you wouldn't. That's fine. It turns out that when I started writing this talk, I was like, oh, I'm an iOS developer. There's so many things I can talk about iOS. But it turns out, I think a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are actually sort of relevant to anyone who does native development. I have this sort of tendency to give like these philosophical and less technical talks. Not because I don't love seeing super technical content, but I don't personally like writing it. A little bit about me. I'm Samuel Giddins. I work on the mobile developer experience team at Square. I've been there for about 2 years now. And before that, I did a bunch of iOS open source stuff. I worked on Ruby Gems and Bundler and was the release manager for both of those for several years. I worked at this startup that no longer exists called Realm. And I was the lead on CocoaPods for approximately forever. So if you're like, oh, that username, SE Giddins, looks familiar, or I've seen that face somewhere before, it was probably me commenting on a GitHub issue. So what do all these things that I've worked on have in common? It turns out that basically all the stuff I've done in my engineering career has been focusing on building tools for other developers. So you might ask, Sam, why the heck would you do that? So one of the really fun things about building tools for other people is it's really high leverage. Everything I can build that saves someone, a minute or an hour, will multiply that by the number of people who use a tool, and you've saved, 50 minutes or 50 hours. So it's really cool to be able to put in that small amount of work and get a big amount of benefit, down the line. It's also really fun to build things for the engineers who sit around me. When I'm building tools, my customers are my teammates. And that means, like, when I fix a bug or make something better, I get to hear about it, not a couple of weeks from now or a couple of years from now. I get to hear about it like, oh, hey, thanks for fixing that thing before lunch. I appreciate that. And that's pretty rewarding. It's also a lot easier to do open source stuff and share what I do and talk about it because it's not super core to like, the secret sauce of what makes Square money. All this stuff is generally applicable across many companies. And it's also a unique skill set, and it's less common to find it among, the average engineering population. And there's a part of me that's just kind of drawn to doing unique things. So you might be thinking, what about this topic actually has to do with iOS developers? So a super, super quick trip throughout history of being an iOS developer. There was iPhone OS, before iPhone OS 2.0. If you wanted to build an app, you had to build a jailbreak app. There was no app store. There was no official SDK. So, a couple of people were like, it would be really cool if I could build an app and make the screen flash different colors. And those were the sorts of apps that we had for a year. And then, iPhone OS 2 came out. We eventually then got the iPad, and iPhone OS became iOS. And funny enough, now, this year Apple's like, well, we had enough of iOS, so now we're also going to have iPad OS. They like changing names on us. But we had a few years of sort of smaller apps. You had a lot of apps being built because every company was like, well, I don't know much about technology, but I go to all these like MBA person conferences and everyone says, well, your company needs to have an app. It needs to be mobile, which was great for us iOS developers because it meant there were a lot of jobs building a bunch of apps. And then iOS 7 came along. And, everyone sort of started rewriting everything because the entire design language of the system had changed. And a lot of our expectations around what made up an app and particularly what made up a good app was changing. And in that era, apps started to get really big. And, well, now you have a bunch of multinational companies that have entire businesses that are based off of their mobile apps. So there are a bunch of iOS apps that are like, just that iOS app is bigger than all of the code ever written at some small companies. So to sort of think about that, think about like the Facebook app or the Instagram app, Gmail or Airbnb or Uber, and of course Square. These are truly massive iOS applications. They have more features than you'll ever see browsing around the app. I think we probably have thousands, maybe 10,000 lines of code just devoted to our debug settings for our QA team to use. That's more lines of code than are in a bunch of apps. But it's not just those big apps that have gotten bigger. Even the smallest apps have gotten bigger over the years, as the expectations of being a good app on the iOS platform have grown. So back in the golden days of being an iOS developer, you got a nav bar, you put a table view in it, you asked one of your friends who called themselves a designer to cut up some PNGs for you so you could stick them into the buttons and stuff. You wired up a couple of calls to a CRUD API, and you were done. You shipped it to the App Store. It was great. Now, the baseline expectations have gotten so much bigger. You're expected to have an app that works across, a dozen different form factors, and the collections that you display in the app need to all be really pretty, and they have to have physics associated with them, and all the data is supposed to sync instantly across the world. And your app should support multitasking on the iPad and have extensions, so you can tweet out for whatever your app does. Handle multiple input options like a TV remote or an Apple Pencil in addition to your finger. It should restore state whenever someone closes your app and reopens it 5 seconds later, because we've all done that. So, getting back to it, I work on a massive application. So this is actually kind of a joke. We don't have 480 source files. We have 480 modules, each of which has anywhere in the range from 10 to 1,000 source files in it. And then we have tests, at least one test bundle for each one of those modules, sometimes 2 or 3. And then, of course, we don't just have one application. We have 6 massive applications because, of course, business reasons dictate that we have to ship multiple apps to the App Store, for marketing reasons and clarity of purpose or something that someone much above my pay grade understands better than I do. But all of these applications are built on a common platform. They're built, across multiple engineering teams, across half a dozen different offices spread throughout the world. spanning different organizations in the company, like different top-level organizations. So we have some engineers who sit under the finance org, some in our seller organization, some in like the e-commerce organization. And each of those teams, of course, has their own product managers and designers. And I'd say about 90% of those teams are responsible for shipping features to our end users. I'm, of course, in the 10%. I ship features to everyone else in the company. So it turns out that, server engineers hit this sort of size, this size of application, this size of team, they call it scale, a long, long time ago. And they had a solution, which is a discipline that's typically called platform engineering, which is kind of a mix of DevOps stuff and writing frameworks for people. It's a combination of keeping things shipping and abstracting away as much of the boring code as possible. You have an app like Square, and like there are, I haven't counted, but probably thousands of uses of like a button in the app, and all the buttons are supposed to be styled the same way. So of course we have a team that's responsible for like making the button. So the thing is, we had this discipline for a while, on back-end teams, but we didn't start seeing it develop on mobile because it took mobile teams a lot longer to get to this scale. It also turns out that mobile platforms, because they're almost entirely native, have much more first-party tooling. So, like, show of hands if you've ever heard someone say, oh, we don't need, XYZ open source tool. Apple gives us everything you need to build a great app. I mean, everyone's at least thought this at some point in time. All the pundits on Twitter like to say it. So this is sort of the prevailing attitude in the Apple community. Apple gives us Xcode, they gave us Objective-C and Swift, they give us UIKit and Core Data, and that's enough. So that may have been true 10 years ago, when a lot of apps were, a couple of people collaborating on a single application. In their free time, they push it to the App Store, maybe they update it once a year when everything breaks with the new version of iOS, and that's about it. But, now, like, I work for a 4,000-person business that makes money primarily through iOS and Android apps. Apple tools aren't built to handle this scale. There are a bunch of problems that Apple's tools just don't solve for, and honestly, that Apple isn't trying to solve for. So, enter my team. We came to this realization slightly before I was hired that, like, okay, stuff is starting to slow down a lot. We aren't shipping features as quickly as we need to. Our developers are getting unhappy. We need to get a new team to fix this, because in a big company, creating a new team is the only way you fix anything. And when coming up with the first charter for the team, we were trying to figure out, like, what are we actually going to do? And we just looked over to what the server folks did and copied the list of stuff that they do. Things like, we'll maintain a developer environment. So, like, you go and clone the repo, and you can just hit build and it'll work. No more like, I wonder, do I have the right version of Ruby installed? And, oh, you needed this fork of this open source library. You didn't tell me that. Well, give me another day and I'll get everything working. Can help write some tests or make it easier to write tests. No shame in this, but show of hands if you work on an app that has like less than 5 tests in it. Yeah, that's fine. I'm not here to tell you that's a bad thing. But, like, our app moves money, and we kind of want to make sure that when you click the move the money button, the money moves. And, in concert with the tests is, well, it's great to have tests, but we should really make sure that those tests, pass on a consistent basis. So, again, show of hands if you've ever worked on a project where, there were tests, but no one ever ran them, and you're pretty sure they don't even build anymore. So, my team goes and maintains that sort of stuff. Deployment. Uploading stuff to the App Store can be pretty time-consuming. Dealing with provisioning profiles and code signing errors. And when, someone tells you that, hey, you need to ship a new version of the App Store of every app every 2 weeks. And also, hey, by the way, you need to ship new versions of all those apps to internal QA every day. And also, hey, we have this beta program, so we also need to ship updates of the beta version of the app every couple of days. That could be a full-time job. There's also the amorphous frameworks. So I was talking earlier about, time spent building a canonical button class at Square. So we have stuff like that, things to make building a consistent UI easier. We also open source this great framework called workflows that try and make the flow of state and navigation through an app easier to build, easier to test, more easy to write in a consistent and pluggable manner. And there's also the sort of task automation stuff, let's update our dependencies, let's update all of the snapshot tests that we have and go and download those 4,000 new images when you change how the little button works. And my favorite is build systems. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in between you pressing that play button in Xcode and getting an app that pops up on your simulator. And, most of the time it just sort of works, but when it doesn't, it's really a pain to figure out why. And, there's Xcode itself, the IDE. There are some companies, one of which I will name and shame, called Facebook, which decided that Xcode wasn't working for them, and so they'd go and invest in writing their own IDE for iOS development. So the goal of all this is really to allow as many engineers as possible to focus on building their product. Because you want them to be the experts in your app. You want them to know how the app works from a user's perspective. You want them to know that this is the flow from opening the app to creating an invoice and adding a customer to the invoice and adding an address and sending the invoice. So the way I like to frame it is that our goal is to make the path from a product manager or a designer coming up with an idea to the engineers having that built in the app as easy as possible. And easy here doesn't just mean in amount of time, but also in amount of frustration, in amount of bugs that get shipped, in amount of ability to, when said product managers and designers change their mind and completely nix what they originally came up with, to adapt and not have to throw all your work away. So if you work on a small team, I know that this may sound super strange. I used to have this attitude when I'd see people at these big tech companies tweeting about my team of 6 people that does XYZ is hiring I'm like, you have 6 people and you're trying to hire more and you don't even ship a full app by yourselves? What are you all doing? I had that reaction too. But honestly, there are a bunch of small parts of our jobs we all try and ignore, and we wish that we didn't have to do. Things like updating to new versions of Xcode. which, if you're unlucky, can be a multi-month-long process. Like Apple changes stuff. Updating to new Xcode versions means new iOS SDKs, and if you have enough code, eventually some of it's going to break on any given change. Things like keeping the build passing. So, every time someone makes a commit, we want to make sure that things go green and stay green. In one of our Android Slack channels, actually, yesterday, I saw someone saying, like, no more merging. Things are red. Do not make things any redder. Our goal is to make that not something that someone ever needs to say. As I was saying earlier, like uploading builds to TestFlight in the App Store is annoying, and Xcode is Xcode. So it does silly stuff from time to time, and then I get to go spend a couple of weeks being like, oh, Xcode, why you do this to me? If you have enough code, eventually building all that code gets slow. And when building your app from scratch takes like 20 or 30 minutes, people get real unhappy. Updating, like if you have a bunch of different network endpoints that your app hits, and maybe you want to like generate the code that does requests and parses responses using something like protobufs. Well, that's a whole other set of infrastructure that no one really wants to maintain. So as you reach a certain team size, it makes sense to invest in expertise in these types of problems. So this goes back all the way to the beginning to the concept of leverage. If you get one person to focus on these little things that are annoying even when you're one person working on an app, well, getting one person to focus on these problems full time so that 10 or 20 or 50 other people don't have to starts to make some sense. So, as I was saying earlier, there's something in here for anyone to learn, regardless of team size. We all have the same problem set. Some problems are just more apparent in some teams than others. There's kind of naturally, as your team gets bigger, you're going to have more problems because you have more people writing code. And as we all know, code creates problems. So every time you see someone complaining that something's frustrating, they're frustrated, they're angry, they're ready to throw their laptop out the window, they've decided to go and leave early and just sit in a cafe and de-stress all day after working in your code base, see if you can invest in making a permanent fix, making it so that that frustration doesn't happen on a regular basis to everyone. Because the everyday frustrations of being a developer pile up. I went through the laundry list of, well, that's not too fun, and that's not great when that happens. But if you have a bad day, like your entire day can be all of that, and then your entire week's all of that, and then you haven't actually done anything to make your app better so you could ship the new version. There's the classic XKCD that says, the number one programmer excuse for legitimately slacking off is saying, my code's compiling. Who amongst us hasn't been like, well, I just hit build. This is going to take a while, so I'm going to go walk down the hall and grab a coffee. And when you go and grab the coffee, you end up running into someone and you end up talking. And you get back to your desk like 15 or 20 minutes later, only to find out that the build failed like 12 or 13 minutes ago because you had a typo. I've done it. So no matter how many engineers you have, these frustrations are very real costs that your team faces. Because that time spent wasted, that time spent saying, well, my code's compiling, so I guess I can't do anything now, either means that you ship fewer features, or you have to hire more engineers. And either way, that's a very, very real cost. So this is a graph of one of our builds from a while back, and as you can see, there were about as many red builds as green builds. That was a fun day. When I pulled the screenshot of this and showed it to my team, they were like, "Oh, I know what build that was. That's the all 64 build." I was like, the fact that you can tell that just from how often it fails makes me sad. And, every time the build goes red, someone has to go and look at why. This is super frustrating every time this happens, because you have to go and you're doing something and you get disrupted, and you have to go and look into a build, maybe a build that was kicked off by another engineer's changes. Or maybe you just created a branch and fixed a typo in a string somewhere, and you make a pull request and now your build's failing, and you're like, I didn't do that. So, my team is investing in building tooling to keep master green because it keeps everyone happy. When master is green, people complain significantly less, and I bet you if I actually conducted a survey, the correlation would be near 1. So we spun up an on-call rotation for people to look into when builds failed. And we're investing in building tooling to handle this so that the whole organization doesn't have to suffer when one little bad commit makes it into master. One of my teammates came into our Slack channel a couple months ago and said, hey, not to be a broken record, but I had to rebuild the same commit 27 times. No rebases, the same exact SHA to get a green build last night. Yikes! If it eventually passed, it probably should have passed the first time the build ran. And, this is, I swear, an actual quote, copy-paste from Slack. And also my reaction to this was wow. Our infrastructure is so bad that you've seen a build fail 26 times in a row. 26 times in a row, which, given how long these builds take, is over the course of at least 12 hours, 26 failures, and your reaction is, I think it might pass if I press build one more time. That was really kind of an indictment of the state of our infrastructure, that there was that little faith that, someone pushed up a build and, they couldn't trust the result they got. I heard someone say, it works on my machine. And yeah, but if it works on one machine, it should work on all of them. And that's kind of a reasonable expectation when everyone is literally issued the same exact laptop running the same exact version of Xcode, on the same version of OS X in the same repo. If it works on one machine, it should work on all of them, and ideally it should pass on the CI machine the first time it runs. So this led to us working on a project to track every test result that happened and be able to ignore known flaky tests. So we can be we run all of our tests a couple hundred times overnight to gather metrics every night and all day on the weekends. We're this has failed now 25 times over the past weekend. With no changes, same commit, it's failed 25 times, passed a couple hundred. That's a flaky test. We're going to go disable that so people don't hit that in their pull requests and have to hit rebuild 26 times. And we'll file a ticket so the team that owns that test can go and look into why it's being flaky. Because that actually may be an indication that not only the test may be flaky, the app may be flaky. And we've caught real bugs that way. A big project that I worked on at the start of this year was, I like coming up with funny names for my project, so this one was called Refinement, because in what is it? If you have a partition of a set, you can create a refinement of a partition by having strict subsets of each of the sets in the partition, something like that. So I came up with a clever name. But what this tool does is it lets you put in a git diff. You put in 2 commits. You say, this is what's on master. This is what's in my pull request. Here is my project. Figure out what didn't change. And so you pass it a scheme, and it says, this test. Well, this test, nothing in this test changed. This test depends on the library that it's testing. That library didn't change. This library depends on 60 other libraries. Did any of them change? And so on and so on. So we could go and stop testing stuff that didn't need to be tested for any particular diff. So we rolled this out, and one of our engineers who works on our retail application came back from vacation, and this is what he had to say. He said, I was on vacation for a bit and came back this week and noticed that my builds were super fast. Sometimes I'd see builds take 30 to 45 minutes, where I'd typically only modify things that touch the retail app, but I've noticed them go down to about 5 minutes, except for the all job. But this went from over an hour to about 30 minutes, which is still huge. Just want to say how awesome that is. Seeing the reduced build times have made me nurse PRs with less time, and I presume freeing resources for other folks. So optimizing that PR build pipeline from let's run every single test every single time to let's run tests that are actually testing the change that you're making meant that members of the team could submit new PRs and get them merged faster, and again with less risk of running into their flaky tests or less risk of running into a merge conflict. So in the time that someone took to rerun a test 26 times, well, now you could submit 20 new pull requests instead of the previous 10. That was pretty cool. Another cool thing about this tool is, we at Square are big into mono repos. Funny enough, I don't think we understand the word mono repo, because the whole Simpsons blackboard joke with the monorail. Mono equals 1, rail equals rail. Well, mono equals 1, repo equals repo. We have multiple mono repos. So the mono repo that I'm sort of in charge of is the seller iOS mono repo, also known as the iOS mono repo, because we were there first, and so we got the name iOS. But we also have the Cash app at Square. They have their own mono repo, and they adopted this tool refinement. They didn't tell me they were going to start using it. They just sort of started using it. They came in, they were like, so here's the graph of our build times. We turned on this thing you built last week. Hope that's okay. Hour, 25 minutes. Zero involvement from me. So that was pretty cool to have built a tool that, could go and help other teams in the company, other orgs in the company even. And because it's open source, for all I know, and don't burst this bubble, it's helping other people outside of Square. So another thing that my team has recently started looking into is adopting Basil for our iOS builds. So Basil, being a Google project, has the nifty tagline, built for scale. Also built for buzzwords. So Basil is definitely towards the big team end of solutions for solving problems iOS developers have. But other companies at Square's size have already paved the way. So the idea behind Basil and what makes it better for scale, in case you haven't heard of it, is that it's a build system that has much better parallelism. It has support for distributed caching and has much finer grained control over how you produce build artifacts than, let's say, Xcode build has. So where in Xcode right now we have 480 library targets. In a Basil world, Basil's built so you could take those 480 things and split them up into like 4,800 things. Which, if you do it right, can really speed up builds. And again, with caching, that means that you can go from like, I was on vacation, I came back to work, I pulled master, and I clicked build, and well, there's 30 minutes of my life I'm never getting back to. In a Basil world, it's like, well, I pulled master, I hit build, and it just downloaded the build.app from the cache. Well, I guess no coffee for me this morning. But migrating to a significantly different build tool takes a lot of effort, and doing something like that requires building up a lot of specialized knowledge, a set of knowledge that I am by no means an expert in. I was just looking at a bug in Basil earlier today, and it had to do with like trying to link C++ binaries with obc binaries, and I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of out of my depth, and I've been looking at Basil now for a couple of months, so there's a lot of really complicated things that are involved in build tooling. But, just like you hopefully aren't asking like a Java server engineer to write all your table views and put all your buttons into place, I'm of the opinion that it would be a mistake to have, just your random iOS developer go ahead and replace your build system. Projects like this require a combination of ownership and expertise. Ownership because it's not the sort of project where you can land a change and then say, well, we did it, we're done. I'm going to go and retire now. See y'all later, have fun. If you land a new build system, you're on the hook for maintaining it. You have to go and deal with the annual Xcode upgrades, and you have to make sure you add in support for all the new features that Apple ships. So like a great example this year would be things like, well, the Swift UI, dynamic preview stuff is awesome. Your engineers are going to expect that to work. And so if you get off the Apple tool chain, you're going to have to take ownership of making that stuff work. And, the expertise, again, is a lot of stuff like, well, there's this one flag to LD that, when we don't pass it in for some reason, we can still build things, but Apple won't accept our binaries anymore. And when you make changes like this, you really need someone who's going to have the expertise to look into that and unblock you shipping to the App Store. So at Square, we have a platform engineering organization. I think since I wrote this slide, we have been reorged and renamed, as one does at Square. We are now the PI team, Platform and Infrastructure Engineering. And it's got, over 100 people who do servery type stuff, like maintaining the DNS servers and deploying new machines in the data center and imaging them and, putting the containers and the Kubernetes and all those buzzwords onto those machines and keeping the data center running. Our mobile developer experience team, which is trying to solve kind of the same problems, it's currently 2 people for iOS and 4 for Android. So funnily enough, my team got reorged into the platform engineering team. And so I no longer get to say, oh, well, they have so many people and we don't, because I now am one of those so many people. But at the end of the day, I believe that investing in these problem areas allows us as a team, as a company, as an industry, as a community to start to scale. Trying to fix these problems head on rather than closing our eyes and hoping that, well, maybe next year Apple will fix this for us, has let us go from a team of like 50 total mobile engineers to over 150 and one application in the App Store to over half a dozen, all built on the same shared primitives. So I think that no matter what size your team is, investing in increasing developer productivity and happiness is worth it. I think there are really two takeaways here. And the first is that it takes practice to be able to do this sort of work. It takes building up sort of a muscle memory. So if you don't have someone who does this sort of stuff, find someone on your team who's interested and help them level up in this area. Give them ownership over updating Xcode or, getting rid of the warnings in the app or bumping the minimum deployment target, that sort of thing. Find someone who's willing and say, you're the owner of CI now. You're the owner of our test stability. And the other takeaway is that the longer you wait to fix these problems, the harder it becomes. Getting ahead of the problem is easier than, again, closing your eyes and hoping that one day you'll wake up and all those problems will be gone. Because eventually you're going to open your eyes and you're going to be like, this is fine, dog. You'll be like, when did the house catch on fire? Also, wait, why are none of my engineers sitting at their oh, their code's compiling. I'll see them tomorrow. So, courtesy of a recent XKCD about question asking, I guess we have time for a couple of questions.